let's begin with Saturn mythology. Now, Saturn or Saturnus, who was the Roman god in Roman mythology, basically equivalent to the Greek Chronos, where they basically got him from. Now, we talking about 5th century BCE, right? So we had the Temple of Saturn built in Rome around 497 BCE. So this was something that they wasn't just, you know, messing around with. This was something serious for them to build the kind of monuments they built to Saturn and everything that surrounds Saturn mythology. These people were serious about Saturn. So now you also had the a festival in Rome called Saturnalia. Now Saturnalia was basically a festival that started December 17th to December 23rd, and they basically made a sacrifice to the temple of Saturn. They exchanged gifts. They basically partied. Now, Saturnalia was also called the Festival of Light. They basically lit a bunch of candles that celebrated their quest for enlightenment, their quest for knowledge and truth. Now, also, you had, after the festival, you had the birthday of the unconquerable sun, which was December 23rd. So, this all goes into the whole winter solstice thing. This goes into Jesus and the whole Jesus mythology about him being born December 25th. It's not a coincidence that the birth and death of Jesus is right around the same time when you get into the winter solstice. So you have Jesus dying on the cross of the zodiac and rising again, with the whole rising of the sun after the winter solstice. Remember, the sun is dead for a couple of days, then it rises again, symbolizing rebirth. This is what all this stuff is talking about. This is what it's getting into. But there's more to this because you got to understand which sun is talking about. You got to understand what Rome was really about, what their place was, what they was trying to do as far as getting out of the ancient world and bringing into place a new kind of, let's say, mythology or a new kind of way to spread their rule. And it's basically what took place when you have Christianity come into place, which we're going to get into. So after they celebrated the birthday of the unconquerable sun, they celebrated the renewal of light, which was basically New Year's. So the Romans basically celebrated these things for over 500 years until Christianity came into play and basically, outlawed everything and said everything was pagan and devil worship or what have you, even their own worship, even the documentation of them being pagans or what have you, Christianity came into play, and then we eventually get Christmas and New Year. So this is basically where this stuff comes from. It all really goes back to Saturn. So now we already know that they worship Saturn as a sun. Now, the thing we're going to get into in this video is you have to understand, when was Saturn a sun? And a lot of people will tell you, and from a lot of books that you will read, that Saturn was a sun that wasn't that long ago. Now, you got to think about it. If they was worshiping Saturn back in the 5th century BCE, that's not that long ago. That's in human history, recorded history, so to speak. They was worshiping Saturn as a sun. So think about it. It wasn't a telescope wasn't invented until like the 17th century. So they obviously was seeing something that pertains to Saturn, and it was something about Saturn that they seen that made them worship it. Besides, just the rings. And this is what we're going to get into, because you got to understand about this Saturn as a sun and what it really pertains to. And a lot of times, what you're going to find out in this video as well, when we think it's talking about the sun that we know of today, it's talking about Saturn. So then they had to have been able to see Saturn from Earth. And when you pay attention to the other planets that they are obsessed with in the occult, particularly Mars and Venus. Now, I mentioned before, Venus, when it goes into its 8-year cycle, it does so in the shape of a 5-pointed star. And we know the 5-pointed star is associated with, Satanism. It's associated with witchcraft. It's associated with Lucifer, the light bearer. And we know when a lot of people see this is immediately what they run to. Now, also, what a lot of people don't realize is Venus and Mars aligns with Saturn to give us this, to give us the great light, to give us the bright star. This is a very ancient symbol that you're going to see a lot in this video, and you're going to see a lot in the ancient world when you look. Now, also, during the formation of these three planets, of the planets aligning, you get this symbol of the crescent and the star. And again, this is another symbol that we see a lot in the ancient world. Now, most people, when you see the crescent and the star, you got to understand which one you're looking at. You got to understand if you're looking at ancient world symbol, which is what we see commonly in ancient Mesopotamia. You see this with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, or what have you. The formation, the beginning of the formation of these planets. But then you also get the crescent and star when you're looking at the moon and the sun, which alludes to a lot of stuff in Islam, as I talked about before. Two separate things. And this is something that confuses a lot of people in their research. You got to understand what it's talking about. And if you don't understand about this formation that takes place and about this bright star, remember, Venus is the bright and morning star. But you got to understand about the bright star and why they call it the bright star and what it all pertains to, which we're going to get into. Now, a lot of you have seen this before. Now, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, just like the ancient Egyptians, they left behind a lot of clues, a lot of artifacts that we can still see today. Now, in this depiction, you see the seated man. You see these three men, and you see this wheel. Now, when you look at the wheel, look at the power coming from it. Look at the shape, the design it's in. It kind of sort of resembles the morning star I just showed you with the alignment of the planets. Now, to a lot of people, it represents Saturn. And when you look at the wheel, when you look at that alignment, it kind of sort of looks exactly like it. So there are other things in this whole picture as well. When you look at the wavy lines on the ground, when you look at the waves in the body of the seated man, as well as the third man in line, they have waves in their bodies as well. Now, a lot of people believe that these waves represent energy, power. You see the waves on the wheel as well. This is supposed to represent the power of Saturn, the energy that Saturn is supposed to be putting out, and how it's affecting us in reality. Now, the seated man is supposed to represent Shamash. Shamash is the Babylonian sun god who is associated with the planet Saturn. So now when a lot of people see this, this is something that a lot of people do not put together, the association of Shamash and Saturn. So now a lot of people in the ancient world said that Shamash represents Saturn, and Saturn being the dark star. It was another name they had for Saturn as the dark star. This is something that you'll find throughout the ancient world, and in a lot of readings, you'll hear people refer to Saturn as the dark star, being like this sun that basically puts out the same energy, has the same effects on the planet as the sun that we know today, the morning sun. But this sun has the same effects, but also other effects on the planet. Remember, we can't ignore back in ancient times how much they worshiped the sun or Saturn. So supposedly there were two suns in the sky. This whole second sun that they are referring to was supposed to be the sun we know today. The sun we know today is the second sun, and the first sun is supposed to be Saturn. Now, the symbol that the seated man or Shamash is holding in his hand is supposed to represent Thorazaz. Now, Thorazaz is a symbol that is seen all throughout the ancient world. You'll see it a lot. When you understand it, you'll start pointing it out a lot more. Now, Thorazaz is associated with monsters. It's associated with giants. It's associated with the god Thor and Mjolnir, Thor's hammer. And we know that these things are supposed to represent power. Thor's hammer has electricity. It's a powerful weapon. Thorazaz is also associated with the planet Mars. Now, again, these things start to come together when you start paying attention. And as I said, this glyph, this picture has a lot of stuff in it that we can't get all into right now. But when you look at it, you also see the same type of representation in ancient Egypt. So the Assyrians and the Babylonians was both trying to tell us the same things, as well as a bunch of other cultures around the world. They was trying to point out something, and it pertains to Saturn, as we'll get into. But now, I want to read from David Talbert's book called The Saturn Myth. And I want you to understand, like, a lot of people got into this stuff. A lot of people really talk about this kind of information. And as you can see, he wanted to give us that symbol, as you can see clearly on the front page. And again, this is a really, really ancient symbol. So it's saying here, anyone attempting to trace the Saturn legend must reckon with the primordial god figure whom ancient races celebrated as the Great Father, and who is said to have first organized the heavens and founded the antediluvian kingdom. Antediluvian basically means a kingdom without the religious control that we basically see today. The antediluvian kingdom of peace and plenty, the golden age. While few of us today can locate Saturn in the starry sphere, the earliest astral religions insist that the planet god was once the all-powerful ruler of heaven, but paradoxically, they also declared that he resided on earth as a great king. He was also the father both of gods and men. This dual character of the great father has been the subject of a centuries-long but unresolved debate. Was he a living ancestor, subsequently exaggerated into a cosmic divinity, or was he originally a celestial god whom later myths reduced to human proportions? The overwhelming preoccupation of ancient ritual is with an ancient great god. The myths say that the god emerged alone from the cosmic sea as the preeminent power in the heavens. Out of watery chaos, remember the waters of noon, he produced a new order. The ancients worshipped him as the creator and the supreme lord of the cosmos. This solitary god, according to the legend, founded a kingdom of unparalleled splendor. He was the divine ancestor of all earthly rulers. His kingdom, the prototype of the just and prosperous realm. Throughout his reign, an unending spring prevailed. The land produced freely, and men knew neither labor nor war. In the god king's towering form, means giant, ancients perceive the heaven man, a primordial giant whose body was the newly organized cosmos. The legends often present the figure as the first man or primordial man, whose history personified the struggle of good and evil. Whether emphasized the great father's character as creator, first king, or heaven man, widespread traditions proclaim him to be the planet Saturn. In investigating the traits of the archaic god, we must give greatest way to the oldest astral religions, those which are closest to the original experience. The best material coming from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia provides a remarkably coherent picture of the god and enables one to see the development and the distortions of the idea among later peoples. The ancients conceived Saturn as the visible intelligence bringing forth the cosmos as his own body and regulating its revolutions. Thus was the planet denominated the heaven man, a being eventually recalled as the prototype of the human race, the first ancestor. When Saturn departed the world, the golden age catastrophically ended. This is the universal tale of the dying god, the overthrown first king or fallen first man. Whether betrayed by a dark force or chastised for having committed the forbidden sin or inflicted with old age. Notice this has to do with war and time and a wariness of mankind. The result is the same. A corruption of nature, which we are seeing today, and a progressive worsening of the human condition, which we have seen. The story is the first, and one could almost say only theme of tragedy and drama in antiquity. Saturn's golden age came to a sudden and catastrophic end, either caused by or accompanied by the fall of the great god. Now, when you read that, when you start getting into talks like this about Saturn, talking about the ancient mythologies and fables, Saturn, when it's talking about this great man, it's talking about Saturn. Understand, it's God that he's talking about, this king that he's talking about. He is metaphorically talking about Saturn. It's a parable in there too. You got to understand that these people, as I said, they can't give it straight to you. They're giving it to you in parable. So what he's talking about, David Talbert, he's talking about Saturn being this man. But again, it's a parable within that as well. Understand, everybody talks about this war. So when I say this to you, that in ancient times, they was talking about this war that happened. They was talking about the planet being at peace and stuff like that. Things were good. Something happened. And a lot of people trying to wrap their head around what that was. So again, you had a planet of peace. Everything was fine. Everything was good. Then something happened. And a lot of it is alluding to Saturn falling from a sun, from a star, into basically what it is. And because of that, that brought about the destruction of the planet and the worsening, as he said, of people. And this is something that you are definitely going to see. I'm going to get into in this video as well. Now, when you get into this whole thing so far, when we talk about Samaj, when you look at the depiction of these giants, and I talked about this before, I believe that there was giants here. Everything in my research shows me that that's true. With all of the claims from people who actually work for the Smithsonian, who says that they threw bones in the oceans, they've been hiding giant bones for decades. They are really, who are you going to call when you find these bones? Just think about it. If you found the bones of a giant, you call the authorities or you call whoever that will come and basically cover up the situation. Now, you got to understand, even if it happened today, they have the power to make sure that no pictures get out. You would have to find it yourself, take the pictures, hide the pictures. And if you did post them, hope that a lot of people download them, because they have the capability today to delete them all, to get it from off the internet. So you got to understand that Smithsonian basically was going around covering up these bones and covering up people finding these giant skeletons or what have you. A lot of the pictures that we see today, I don't believe it's real, but some of them possibly could be. But we know it's a cover up. But again, I talked about this before. So many ancient civilizations talking about giants and giants coming down to Earth. So if they talking about giants coming down to Earth, then this means that, they was there to see it, meaning that men was already here when these giants was coming down. So the Bible talks about the sons of God coming into the daughters of men. Now, a lot of us believe that these giants coming down was from Saturn. This is where they came from. And that they came down here and they set up kingdoms. Now, again, we wasn't created here. We was obviously created somewhere else, and we was put here for whatever reason. And whatever happened, happened. But these giants at some point must have came down and they began to set up, kingdoms and rule. And so whatever happened to them happened. So again, the sons of God coming into the daughters of men, as I talked about before, it's not uncommon to see this as being possible, as these regular men that was already here on Earth having children, and then these giants coming down and having sex with them. As I talked about, they say that these giants range between 7 and 30 feet tall. These are some huge beings. It's not inconceivable to see a 7 or 8 foot man having sex with a regular woman, as I showed you before with Shaq and Hoops, Yao Ming and his wife. You're talking about really tall people, even Manute Bol and his wife, really tall people that exist, that we know exist, having sex with, even shorter than average women. So it's not uncommon. So a lot of people believe that they came down, they set up these kingdoms, and they did bear children with regular human women, and they would be the heir to these kingdoms. So again, this is stuff that is, one, they try to hide, but you find it in so many different places in antiquity about these giants coming down, to the planet. Now, obviously, something happened to those ancient civilizations. Something happened that caused things to go from one way to, to another. So now we are basically left with a bunch of artifacts and a bunch of evidence, but really we don't have the complete picture. We're still trying to put it together. So a lot of us are still left wondering, what the hell happened? What's going on? Now, I talked about Ptah, talked about Atum, and the whole ancient Egyptian creation story. So now when you go back and you look at what the ancients was talking about, they clearly understood that something, from space created Earth, created us. Now, the thing is, what the evidence is alluding to is that this has a lot to do with Saturn, that Saturn somehow has a lot to do with our creation. So when you go back and you start looking at the early depictions of God and of the sun, you see these, you see this and this. Now, we had it all wrong. They had it all wrong when they first found these symbols. A lot of people saw these symbols and remember they called it the sun symbol. Remember with the hole. And you look at the other symbol and it was supposed to represent the zodiac. But these are really ancient symbols. Really ancient. And what they represent is this. And they basically represent the aligning of the planets with Saturn. Now, when you look at that, it makes a lot more sense. One, when you look at the sun we have today, you're trying to figure out what is that dot in the middle? What is that hole there? Now, when you apply the whole image of the alignment of the planets, this symbol makes more sense. And then when you couple that with the star, with the whole light that it produces, the other symbol makes sense as well. Now, one of the other things this symbol with the crosshairs represent is basically the 4 phases of solar configuration. The 4 phases of solar configuration. And these configurations basically is when the alignment is taking place. And when it's basically coming from out of alignment, you will get these solar configurations. Now, understand, we're talking about stuff that we see with the Assyrians, the whole, ancient Mesopotamia. Now, when you look over the Arabian desert, you see this symbol. They still have it down there. Take a look. You see the symbol of this solar configuration. And when you see those carvings, when you see those drawings in the ground, this whole alignment that's talking about this solar alignment, it's something that was documented that you can't overlook. So again, when we start looking into this thing, it's a lot more to Saturn than meets the eye. So now, even when you look at the crescent and star, when you look at this solar configuration that gives us the crescent and star, it makes more sense that it pertains to Saturn and not with the moon and our sun, the sun that we know today. Because one, when you look at Islam, we're talking about the worship of the Kaaba, and they're walking around the Kaaba. The Kaaba is the black square. We know the black square has to do with Saturn. It is unmistakable. So again, what you're going to find, and I'm going through this because what you're going to find, as I said, is a lot of the things that we pertain to the sun we know of today does not equate to that. It is talking about Saturn as a sun. So now, here's the thing. And this is one of the things that will confuse you. And unless you one of them people that really do really deep research and you really question everything. This is why I question everything that they tell us, even the books that I read. I go and do the research and I question the sources. Excuse me, because you have to. Because a lot of people, even the excerpt that I gave you from David Talbert's book, it's a lot of misconceptions in there. A lot of stuff that he don't understand clearly and a lot of mistakes. But when you a person that really research, you get this stuff. But what is known in esoteric circles, deep in esoteric circles and deeply in the occult, is that the ancients, the people who was in the mystery schools, the people who really understood this information, their day began at night. Plain and simple. That makes a whole lot more sense when you hear that. Their day started at night. There's no way you can catalog and calculate the heavens, that you can, deify the things that they deify, like the moon and the sun. You get what I'm saying now? It makes more sense. Unless you begin your day at night. Because one, the sun that we know today, the sunlight, basically hid everything. The heavens or, space didn't really reveal itself until the sun went down. You start to understand what the Book of the Dead is talking about more, going forth by day. What it's talking about is alluding to the sun going down. We'll get into this a lot more later. But Everything basically started to take place when the sun went down and then Saturn was visible. But, you know, it doesn't take away from any of the mythologies, or you can completely understand why the sun that we see in the sky today could be deified. Make no mistake, you know, it's not a mistake that it is deified, because it has the power that it has, as I talked about in the previous video. But when you understand that the ancients, that they begin their day at night, and that Saturn was also a sun, that there was two suns, when you understand this, a lot of things start to open up for you in your research, and things start to make a lot more sense. And you start to see that, wait a minute, a lot of stuff that we ascribe to, you know, the sun we see outside today is really talking about Saturn, and Saturn during the time it was a sun. And that becomes a lot more clear the deeper you go into the ancient world. So again, almost every time we're looking at a depiction or something alluding to our sun in ancient times, it's not talking about the sun in the sky today. It's talking about Saturn as a sun. It's really important that you understand that this is a big deal, really big deal. So now when you go back and you look, remember, you have in Judaism, and Judaism is basically the worship of Greek mythology, which is the worship of, basically stealing from Egyptian mythology. But again, when you break down Greek mythology, it's getting into the worship of Kronos, Saturn, still dealing with Saturn. Remember, the Jews, it all goes back to Greek. Remember, as I pointed out in my videos, how the Greeks, Ptolemy II Philadelphia is how they created Judaism or what have you. Remember, the Old Testament, everything, all parallels from Greek mythology, which deals with Kronos and the worship of Saturn. This is why the Jews have the black square, the black square you see on their head. I know you've seen that before. So you see why the Jews worship on Saturday or Saturn Day. Even when you look at the ancient Phoenicians, they worship El. El represents Saturn. So we have the Greeks worshiping Kronos, Saturn, dealing with, Judaism, the worship of Greek mythology, which goes back to Saturn. Same thing with ancient Phoenician, Saturn. When you look at Rome, they have the worship of Saturnus, which is, again, Saturn. So we find it everywhere in the ancient world. And, we see it in Rome predominantly, leading up to the creation of Christianity and the coming of the sun, the worship of the sun, or Jesus Christ, which basically corresponds with the fallen Saturn or the fallen Satan, the day star or the falling star or what have you. It's just what all this stuff is talking about. It all alludes to Saturn. It's all talking about Saturn and Saturn as a sun. No coincidence. You have Jesus representing the sun that we see today. But when you really get into it, you can also put Jesus as being Saturn when you really look at different aspects and you look at what Jesus is associated with. We know Satan is Saturn. So you have, the sun we know of today, Jesus, and you have Saturn. You have connection. There's a lot more to that, but I want to go back. Let's go back to Atum Ra or Atum Re, however you want to pronounce it. And let's look at, this whole thing with the sun. We know that Ra is the eye, the eye of Ra. We know that Ra represents the sun. So the whole thing is, does the sun today, the sun that we have anything to do with an eye? No. So when a lot of people look at Ra as being the sun or Jesus, Horus being the sun, or Horus and Jesus being the same, they are confused. Now, it's not a problem that a lot of people get confused by this. A lot of people make this connection because it's just common sense to put it as the sun we know of today. But when you understand that it's talking about Saturn as a sun, it makes a lot more sense. Does Saturn have an eye? Yes, Saturn has an eye. So we know about Saturn being, having a storm. We know how Saturn with the shape, how it looks like an eye looking down. When you look at the formation of Saturn, when it's starting to formate or come into formation with the planet Mars and with Venus, Again, when you see the crescent shape, the crescent in the star, then look at Lord of the Rings. Let's look at Sauron. Remember, the eye of Sauron represents that shape. You see it as a burning eye, representing Saturn as a sun. Remember, Saturn, the Lord of the Rings. And this is where the stuff is going to. So we can see clearly that the eye is representing Saturn. And this is what it's trying to tell you. It's trying to tell you that it's representing the eye, that it's talking about Saturn and not the sun we know of today. A lot of people won't make that connection. And a lot of us, I remember when I first, start getting into this information, the same thing. I had in the back of my head, well, Saturn as a sun, it does make more sense. But it's really hard to go there with Saturn as the sun. But it all makes more sense than the sun we know of today being this eye. So when the ancients looked up at Saturn before the formation, they saw this. They saw Saturn as the eye. They seen Venus. They seen Mars. And we know that the ancient Egyptians love to connect the dots. They love to draw things out of the stars or what have you. So the ancient world, again, was about Saturn and Saturn as a sun. Now, I talked about in Saturn and Satan Part 1 about Saturn being in the Bible. When you read Acts 7:43, it says, "Yea, ye took up the tabernacle of Moloch, and the star of your god Remphian, figures which ye made to worship them, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon." Now, did we not just look at, Babylon or ancient Mesopotamia, Syria, and see these symbols and see that they worship Saturn? Remphian is Saturn. This is what it's alluding to. And when you look up, you can just Google it, Remphian, you'll see it. You'll see what it's talking about. You'll see the star, the so-called Star of David, or the Star of Saturn. You'll see Moloch. When you look at the talisman of Saturn, you'll see Moloch on one side. You'll see the star. Now, remember, Moloch, they sacrificed babies to Moloch. Remember, Kronos, he ate babies. Whenever you see the depictions of that old man eating the baby, that's Kronos. It's the same thing. It's alluding to Saturn, the same stuff. So we know that the star is supposed to represent Satan, that whole five-pointed star, what have you, and it represents Satan because Satan is Saturn. This is what it's all talking about. When you look at the back of a dollar bill, when you look at the crest on the back with the pyramid, you put a star over it. Same thing. You have the star of Saturn. You have the eye of Lucifer, the eye of Satan, the eye of Saturn. Same thing when you put an eye over the layout of Washington, D.C. When you put that star there, you have the star of Saturn. The eye represents, same thing, Lucifer, Saturn, Satan, what have you. But the eye goes over the Scottish Rite Masonic Lodge, as I explained before. So all of this stuff is going back to Saturn. Now, it's funny how when Saturn fell as a star, because it used to be worshipped as a star, everybody in the ancient world worshipped Saturn as a star. When it fell as a star, everything changed. The ancient world was over. Everything was different. And you have basically African people being conquered. The people who was in power was overthrown, was taken over when Saturn fell as a star. That's something really important to think about. So as Black people, we got to look at the fall of Saturn as a sun and look at how Christianity came into play, how modern day religion came into play, and the fall of our, rulership came into play after Saturn fell. There's something you really got to think about. Saturn was called the black sun, the black star. And everybody deeply that's in esoteric studies gets into this, black and white. A lot of people who are really in the know understand the power of Saturn, and that the powers that be have, consequently changed this stuff into Satan. So that if you was a person who was curious, and you was trying to research this stuff and you start getting into this information, guess what you're going to keep running into? I talked about this in my earliest DVDs. Every time I was studying, I kept running into Satan. Every time I got somewhere, I kept running into Satan. And when you run into Satan as a religious person or a person who is not fully conscious, you run back to the Lord. You run back to that Bible. And it's exactly why it was designed that way, to keep you running back. And the thing I kept thinking about was, Satan is real. Satan is 100% real. These people are talking about Satan, 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 Satan. me not understanding, what it all is. It's talking about Saturn. So we as black people got to understand when Saturn fell as a sun, we had the rise of Christianity and modern day religion, us thrown into slavery, our lands conquered, everything taken away from us. So what was it about Saturn that kept us in power? Talked about this before, you got to think about one, the possible effects that Saturn as a sun can have on melanated people. Just think about us absorbing that kind of light. What would it do to us? What would be possible? What would be possible for us to do with that sun present? And we don't know. We don't know. We don't know what that's really about or what's going on with that. So it's something that I have looked into for a long time, and I understand it's a lot of plants and animals extinct since that sun died out. There's a lot of things that's not around no more, a lot of things that do not grow because of that sun, being gone. So these are things that I look into because everything changed. The whole entire world changed. The ancient world was done away, and you had the rise of European power and the takeover of the Europeans when Saturn fell as a sun. Now you got to pay attention to who is good and who is bad. So when you start digging into Saturn and it's alluding to all the satanic stuff, but then when you realize that, the Europeans came up with Christianity and these religions that they supposedly worship, but behind closed door in secret, the esoteric meaning, the hidden meaning, the parable of what they're researching and worshiping alludes to Saturn. But Saturn as a sun, or Saturn as the way it is now. Now it comes into play. It starts to make a lot more sense when you see the worship of Saturn now, the way it is now. What is Saturn doing now? Think about that. Saturn is broadcasting time, as I talked about. Distorting this reality. They are celebrating it. Look at how, as I talked about before, all of these corporations have that Saturn logo. They are celebrating the Saturn now because the Saturn that we see today with the rings represents the destruction of us. It represents their power. It represents the fall of the ancient world and the rise of European power. Plain and simple. This is why they worship it. This is why they use it. Now today, there's still a lot going on with Saturn.